Let's get analysis from Ryan Bohl. He's a senior Middle East and North Africa analyst at RAIN, a global risk intelligence company, and he's speaking to us from Philadelphia. Thank you so much for your time, Ryan. So, cautious optimism about phase 2 talks actually starting this week. Do you think they will go ahead? Because ultimately they should be benefiting both sides.
Yeah, from the very beginning, phase one was the less complicated, more straightforward part of this overarching ceasefire deal. So phase two is where things get particularly tricky. And they get tricky because there are now diametric demands from Israel and Hamas, which neither side is showing any flexibility. Hamas still wants Israel to withdraw. Israel says that it won't unless Hamas surrenders and goes into exile. And so long as those are the two positions of these two parties, they can get to phase two and then find ways to undermine one another and drift back into conflict.
And we always knew that phase 2 was going to be a tough one for those very points that you've outlined there. But how do you think the ceasefire has played out so far? Has it been as successful as it can be?
I think that there's some angles in which, of course, the worst parts of the humanitarian crisis have somewhat ebbed, but aid still has not reached the level that it really needs to be to improve humanitarian conditions in the Gaza Strip. There have been still some ceasefire violations, largely by the Israelis, but also some attempts by militants to deteriorate security conditions. So it has been imperfect, but it's certainly a substantial improvement, at least from a humanitarian standpoint, from what was going on 60, 90 days ago.
Do you think there's still the possibility, though, that if Israel does get all the hostages, those living and those whose bodies are still in Gaza, that they may just resume the war?
I think the Israelis are incentivized to use military and diplomatic pressure to get Hamas to go into exile, to surrender from the Gaza Strip, because they know that military pressure alone in an open ended war won't work for them. The Israelis are war weary themselves. Many of their reservists aren't showing up for duty. So the Israeli government knows that a full scale conflict isn't something that works for them politically. And if it looks like they're starting it, this could also alienate the Trump administration, who's very eager to claim that they ended the war in Gaza. So they're going to be looking for an open ended conflict that looks very similar to their strategy of the war between the wars. The idea that they have military operations that more or less could happen at any time, but are not at the massive scale that we saw during the 15 months of the most intense part of the fighting in the Gaza Strip. That's where the Israelis want to be until Hamas leaves the Gaza Strip.
The Trump administration, though, seems to have a very particular vision for Gaza, or rather Donald Trump himself, and that's making it this Riviera of the Middle East. But it's been heavily criticized by Palestinians as well as many others in the region and internationally. Some commentators, though, have said a different vision for this long-standing conflict in the Middle East is certainly needed. Donald Trump is a maverick, as some have called him, but his controversial vision, does it move the impetus to regional players to take on a bigger role in the future of Gaza and perhaps look at it through a different lens?
Well, certainly it does reframe the conflict, at least from the American perspective, because it very much looks like the Americans are taking a very strong pro-Israel stance, like overwhelmingly pro-Israel stance, saying that essentially the Israelis can do what they want within the Gaza Strip, up to depopulating the Strip, if they believe that will solve the problem. But Washington is leaving open the door that if there's a regional plan that somehow solves Israel's security dilemma in Gaza, it would be open to that too. But that being said, there isn't a lot of American leadership on this, and the region itself is quite divided about the way that it wants to approach this. So it looks like the default, just by eliminating the other options that aren't terribly realistic, looks like it's going to be the Israelis slowly using their military and economic pressure to change the demographics of Gaza, probably by pushing people out over an extended period of time.
Ryan Bohl, thank you so much for your analysis. He's with RAIN, a global risk intelligence company. Thanks, Ryan.